we're going to be looking at part 2 of the special period in time and concluding that and going on to the after 2000s section, okay? So in the last lecture, we looked at the famine and how that basically, and the oil shortage and how that disrupted all of society in Cuba, right, in every aspect. But we can see towards the end that the programs that Cuba was implementing was working in alleviating those issues, and they were finding solutions rather than just sitting. So again, not everything during the special period was negative. If you remember, yes, there was malnutrition because of the famine and poverty-related illnesses. But because they moved towards that vegan diet that I mentioned in the last lecture, diseases like heart attacks and diabetes were reduced. Overall, there was a general health and population improvement in Cuban society. Additionally, the weight average went down because again, they're just eating fruits and veggies and riding their bikes everywhere. So something's bound to happen to your body at that point. Despite these cuts in food subsidies and public spending, political scientists do acknowledge and point out that the poor in Cuba did enjoy far greater protection than the poor in basically any other country at this time. And I know that sounds kind of like weird to say that because they're going through a famine, but basically they're saying if you're poor, you would rather be, I assure you that your life would be a lot better in Cuba than in a place even like the United States, is basically what they're saying, because this is counting for both developed and underdeveloped and developing countries. The reason for that is because, well, poor people in other countries don't really have access to universal healthcare and universal education, right? In Cuba, if you're sick, you can go to your community doctor. If in Cuba, if you're poor, you don't have to have rich, you don't have to be rich or apply for a bunch of scholarships and financial aid in order to go to a university. If you get into that university because you're smart or whatever, you're going to that university at no cost, no matter who you are, even if you're poor, even if you're homeless, even though homelessness is not really an issue in Cuba because basically housing is also universal at that point. So that's not something you really see in a lot of other countries during this time. And so while the conditions for many were difficult for many at this time, many Cubans found comfort in achievements such as the highest ratio per doctors. That means that they have so many doctors. Doctors in the US are very overwhelmed because a lot of them have so many patients, they don't even know their names. They just look at their charts like, oh, it's you, because I see this, this, and this. Versus in Cuba, doctors live in their communities that they serve, and they know when they see the people even outside of the hospital, and they get to interact with them, and they help the generations of those families grow, right? Additional to that, they have the lowest infant mortality rate of the world, meaning, and even lower than the US, meaning there are less babies dying during birth in Cuba than in the US. Despite this, the US and the Western media used the situation of the famine in Cuba to send out this warning sign to the rest of the world that the famine was the result of communism, basically completely leaving out the fact that the embargo was making it worse. Um, you know, and that's it. It's US propaganda, right? And so that's why we see a lot of anti-Cuban sentiment in the US. Next one. So despite all this hardship, the Cuban people remained supportive of Castro and saw him as the leader who would keep the US out of their island. Having this image placed on Castro made him very popular, obviously in Cuba, but in Latin America as well. Many Cubans who had lived under Batista's regime remembered what it was like before Castro, and basically, for the most part, agree it was a lot worse under Batista than it is under Castro. And so a lot of people also viewed going back to the old days of bringing back the US and having the US monopolize everything again and control everything and just, rich get richer, poor get poorer type. And they didn't want that. On the other hand, though, the youth, they didn't grow up under Batista. The youth who had always lived under Castro had a pretty good life. But once the famine starts in the 90s, it's like, oh my God, we don't like this and we want change. And so they start to demand political and economic reforms out of Castro. And Castro begins to grant some of these wishes. And basically, the government works towards kind of changing things up for them. This time period, you also start to see the messaging of the Cuban Revolution get a little bit changed. So before it was attached to, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which brought the USSR basically into this world, right? But Now that that's over, the revolution is now the Cuban Revolution is now tied to Latin American nationalism. The idea of Latin America belongs to Latin America, and we're going to kick out all these European and the U.S. out, and get these American companies out of here. And now the land belongs to the people type of mentality, right? And so because of this, you see resurgence of these ideologies that were pushed by Castro, pushed by Che Guevara, and all these other revolutionaries. And so all of that, the special period does come to an end in 1996 when Castro's brother begins to attack these policies under the special period, and Castro supports his brother doing that. And so they start to implement taxes again to increase taxes on private companies, and the self-employment licenses go up as well. So the goal after 1996 was to bring Cuba back to where it was before the 90s, back to a centralized economy again, so more towards socialism. Next one. So around this time, European Union began to tie any economic assistance to Cuba to shift their economy and politics towards capitalism. They see that Cuba does not fall in the 90s as they predicted and they thought would happen. Cuba survived, right? Cuba survived the famine and all of that. So now they have to do other things, such as saying, if you want any help, you got to get away from socialism and go towards capitalism. You also start to see tourism being impacted because the United States can't let Cuba succeed in any way because they didn't fall during the 90s. So it's like, oh, now you're getting money from tourism, um, terrorist attacks. So now you start to see terrorist attacks every now and then. One of the most notable ones was from a former CIA agent that basically planted a bomb near a tourist hotel and ended up wounding 11 people and killing an Italian Canadian tourist. Um, in order to kind of clean up their image after these types of events, Castro brings in the Pope, invites him over, the most powerful Catholic, I guess I would say. Um, and so John Pope II is the Pope at the time, and he gives 4 masses in Cuba. And this was also kind of to show the world, it's like Cuban socialism is not tied to like atheism and it's accepting of religions. Basically, it's what they're saying. It's not anti-religious, is what Castro's trying to send out. Next one. So in 2000, George W. Bush, he's a Republican, he becomes president, um, the US president. And so this relationship between Cuba and the US gets even worse. That's not to say that things don't get bad under Democrat presidents with the relationship with Cuba. I mean, the freaking Bay of Pigs and happened under a Democrat, which is JFK. The harsher embargo restrictions during the 90s happened under Bill Clinton, who is also a Democrat. So the tone of harshness does not change, to be honest. It's just seen differently under Bush, when Bush basically labels Cuba as the axis of evil. It's basically saying they're like the most evil country that has ever existed, and basically accuses Cuba of sponsoring terrorism, which is really interesting because remember, everything that we've been looking at kind of shows the opposite, where the CIA is sponsoring terrorism, and we know the CIA is a U.S. Government agency, right? So it's really interesting. It's a lot of self mirroring right there by the United States. With the aggressiveness of George W. Bush, Cuba began to brace itself for an additional invasion. It's like, oh, we got to get ready because this guy seems like he has a lot to say about us. So suspicion fell on this one group that all of a sudden just pops out of nowhere called the Varela Project. And it's like, hey, like, yeah, we're a quote unquote, pro democracy movement, even though Cuba has a higher voting rate than the United States. Democracy does exist. We've already seen that in Cuba. But either way, they gather about 11K signatures in this petition to increase to have political reform and increase or increased free market economics. The Cuban government responds by basically having their own counter petition, and they managed to get over 8 million votes with 99% of the Cuban population voting. That's 99% is freaking crazy, guys. Like, we don't get that. We don't get that ever. Nowhere close. So like I said, there's a lot of democratic involvement in Cuba. March 2003, about 75 members of that Varela project are arrested because if they found out, surprise, surprise, they were taking money from foreign agencies to kind of push those political agendas of those foreign agencies. So you know how today we're always like, oh, the Russians are like interfering in our elections. That's basically what the United States was doing in Cuba with the Varela project, interfering in their elections. And so that's why those individuals got arrested, because they were pushing the agendas of the United States. Next one. So Castro has a great influence in Cuba all through his entirety since the revolution. But we see it a lot in the late 90s and in the 2000s, especially with Hugo Chavez. So Castro basically declares that the world is tired of the U.S. bullying everybody. And so you start to see a lot of Latin American countries, and he's right. You start to see a lot of Latin American countries pushing the United States out and electing left-wing leaders. And so Hugo Chavez is one of those people who wins in December 1998. Castro gains an ally out of him, and they start to like basically trade with one another, right? So Chavez refers to Castro as his mentor. Basically, Chavez wants what Cuba did, kick out the United States, nationalize oil, nationalize land, give the poor healthcare and education for free. And out of that partnership between Venezuela and Cuba, Cuba starts to get their oil again. Now today when we look at modern day Cuba and Venezuela, that oil is disrupted because of the sanctions that are being placed and because of the United States involvement in disrupting Venezuela. So, but within the 6 years of Chavez's electoral victory, more than 3/4 of Latin American population is living under democratically elected left-wing leaders. So Cuba had a ripple effect. Cuba, a lot of people who leaders who won these elections credit Castro and Cuba as their examples of and their inspiration. So you do see that Castro and the Cuban Revolution had a really big influence in in Latin America, which proved the United States right in sense of that they were worried that that's what was going to happen. And so because the United States was so worried about that, they implemented the embargo in Cuba, but that only kind of just riled up people more in Latin America to see the US as the enemy for placing that embargo in Cuba when they just wanted to kind of be left alone, you know? So you start to see that. It's like this domino effect that happened that kind of starts to spread socialist ideologies into Latin America. To kind of conclude this chapter, in 2008, Castro was fighting a long illness. I'm not really sure what it is. I don't know if they ever kind of said it. I'm going to assume maybe it was like cancer or something, but he stepped down because of his health issues and he handed the power to his brother. During this time, Castro basically, I think he passed away, I don't know, I think 2015 something. During his time in power, Castro succeeded in changing Cuba, and as a result, he changed the world itself. Whether you agree with Castro's ideology and his, policies, communism, socialism, whatever, right? You have to admit that he did have an impact in the world, and the fact that it's such a tiny island played such a big role in the Cold War. And when we get to the Cold War next semester, you're going to see exactly what I mean and how much of a headache Cuba was for the United States during that era, for Eisenhower, for JFK, for just all of them, all of them. So the fact that he outlasted the Soviet Union collapsed, and they were one of the biggest superpowers outside of the United States. They collapsed. Cuba outlasted them. In addition, every U.S. president during the Cold War that attempted to get rid of Castro, he outlived them, and he outlasted them. So a lot of political scientists say that that's a testament to both the personal qualities of Castro as a leader and just how tactful and smart he was. Whether you agree with it or not, you have to admit that he did a good job at kind of just keeping things together in Cuba, and keeping the U.S. out. And it also shows the resiliency of the Cuban people and how well they all were able to kind of come in united to kind of follow in that vision of the revolution. But that's the conclusion of this chapter. Have a good day.